They had been taught that American soldiers would experiment on the sick, that wounded prisoners would become test subjects for brutal medical trials. So when Catherine Weber collapsed in the barracks of Camp Ruston, Louisiana in September 1945, her fellow German prisoners did the only thing they thought would save her. They formed a human wall around her dying body and screamed at the approaching American medics, "Don't touch her. She's dying. Leave her alone." What happened next would shatter everything they believed about their captors. The barracks interior was dark except for the single bulb hanging from the ceiling, swaying slightly in the humid Louisiana night air. 40 women stood shoulder to shoulder, 3 rows deep, their bodies creating a barrier of flesh and bone and terror. Their faces were twisted with emotions that had been building for months, maybe years. Fear, rage, the desperate cornered fury of people who believed they were making their final stand. Some held broom handles, gripped so tightly their knuckles had gone white. Others clutched metal cups, chair legs, anything that could be used as a weapon. Their eyes were hard and wet with tears at the same time, and their voices had merged into a single chant that rose and fell like a wave crashing against rocks. Rühr sie nicht an. Don't touch her. Sie stirbt. She's dying. Rühr sie nicht an. Don't touch her. Behind the wall on a narrow bunk, Margareta Hoffman knelt beside Catherine Weber's motionless body. Greta's hands were positioned on either side of Kat's face, tilting her head back at just the right angle. She took a breath, pinched Kat's nose, and breathed air into her friend's mouth. Once, twice, 3 times. Kat's chest rose and fell with the forced air, but she wasn't breathing on her own. Her lips had turned the color of storm clouds, a deep grayish blue that Greta recognized from her years as a Wehrmacht nurse. It was the color of death approaching. At the doorway stood 3 Americans in medical uniforms. Captain Robert Brennan had both hands raised, palms out in a gesture of peace that was doing absolutely nothing to calm the situation. He still had his dinner napkin tucked into his collar. His reading glasses hung on a chain around his neck. His medical kit sat on the floor where he had dropped it when the women surged forward with their makeshift weapons. "We're here to help," he said. His voice was calm and clear and carried the authority of a man who had treated thousands of wounded soldiers over 3 years of war. "We're doctors. We want to help your friend," liar, someone shouted in German. Another woman translated into broken English. "You want to use her. Experiment. We know what you do." Behind Brennan, Corporal Grace Tanaka and Corporal James Delgado stood frozen, watching the scene with a mixture of professional urgency and dawning horror. They could see Greta performing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. They could hear the terrible, wet, rattling sound coming from Kat's lungs with each forced breath. They could see the blue tint spreading from her lips to her fingernails. The woman was dying, right there, right then, and a wall of terrified prisoners stood between them and the only chance she had of survival. Brennan's eyes met Greta's across the barracks. For 1 second, just 1 second, 2 medical professionals recognized each other across a divide of language and nationality and war. Greta's eyes were desperate. Brennan's eyes were determined. And between them, Catherine Weber's heart kept beating while her lungs refused to work. How did it come to this? How did 40 terrified German women end up protecting a dying prisoner from American doctors who were desperately trying to help her? The answer lies in a lie so powerful it convinced them that mercy was cruelty and that their enemies were monsters. But first, you need to understand something about propaganda and about the Texas sky that smelled nothing like home. 2 weeks earlier, September 8, 1945, 3 months after Victory in Europe Day, when Germany had finally surrendered and the concentration camps had been liberated and the full horror of the Nazi regime had begun to come to light. Camp Ruston sat deep in the pine forests of northern Louisiana, a sprawling collection of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. The September morning feet rolled through the trees like smoke, thick and white and sweet with the scent of magnolia blossoms. Somewhere in the distance, a radio played Benny Goodman's Sing Sing Sing, the brass section cutting through the humid air with a sound that was pure America, pure jazz, pure freedom. The women's compound occupied one isolated corner of the camp, separated from the main prisoner area by an additional fence. 347 German women lived here. They were not soldiers. They were Helferinnen, the female auxiliaries who had served the Wehrmacht as radio operators. Clerks, nurses, telephone switchboard workers, administrative staff. When Germany collapsed in May, When the thousand-year Reich crumbled into rubble and ash and defeat, these women found themselves swept up in the chaos of surrender. The Allies had no clear protocol for them. They were not quite soldiers, not quite civilians. After months in makeshift holding camps in Europe, they were shipped across the Atlantic to America, to Louisiana, to this place where the air was so thick you could almost drink it, and the mosquitoes were the size of hummingbirds, and the sky was a blue they had never seen before. The barracks were simple wooden structures, each housing 40 women in double-stacked bunks. The building smelled of fresh pine and disinfectant, a sharp contrast to the damp, moldy cellars where many had spent the final months of the war in Germany. There were real mattresses here, thin but clean. Real blankets, rough wool but warm. Windows with glass that actually closed. For women who had survived the bombing of Berlin, the siege of Dresden, the nightmare retreat from the Eastern Front camp, Rustin felt almost comfortable. Almost. The Louisiana air smelled different from anything the German women had known. It was thick and sweet, heavy with magnolia blossoms and pine sap. At night, crickets sang so loudly, it sounded like a symphony. Mosquitoes drilled through the window screens, leaving welts on pale German skin that had never encountered such insects. The heat, even in September, was oppressive to women raised in the cool climates of Northern Europe. But it was the sounds that unsettled them most. Not the sounds of war. No sirens, no explosions, no screaming. But the sounds of American normalcy. A radio in the guard station playing jazz music. Trucks rumbling past carrying supplies. The distant laughter of male prisoners from the main camp during their recreation time. The casual banter of American guards who joked with each other in English the women barely understood. It was all so ordinary, so peaceful, so completely wrong for people who had spent years in a state of total war. Catherine Weber stood at the window of Barracks 7 watching the American guards laugh about something. She was 32 years old, which made her one of the older women in the camp. She was tall and thin, with sharp features and gray eyes that seemed to look right through people. She had served as a senior communications officer in the Luftwaffe, coordinating radio traffic for fighter squadrons. Before the war ended, she had watched Berlin burn from a bunker while trying to maintain contact with units that no longer existed. Now she stood in a Louisiana barracks watching American soldiers smile and joke and eat like kings while Germany starved. She had promised herself she would never forget who these people were, what they had done, what they were capable of doing. Her hand moved unconsciously to the pocket of her prison uniform, where she kept a small pamphlet folded into a tight square. She had found it while unpacking her belongings, hidden among the few possessions that had survived the journey from Germany. The pamphlet was titled Amerikanische Ärzte die Wahrheit, American Doctors, the Truth. The illustrations were lurid and explicit. Prisoners strapped to tables, doctors with needles and scalpels standing over them. Text that described in horrifying detail the medical experiments that American physicians supposedly conducted on captured enemy soldiers. Unnecessary surgeries to practice techniques. Experimental drugs tested on unwilling subjects. Prisoners deliberately infected with diseases so doctors could observe the progression. Kat looked at that pamphlet every night before she went to sleep. It reminded her to be vigilant, to never trust, to remember that the smiles and the food and the comfortable beds were all part of a larger plan. She just didn't know what that plan was yet. Outside, the smell of cooking meat drifted across the compound. Someone was making breakfast in the guard station kitchen. The scent was rich and smoky and made Kat's stomach clench with hunger, even as her mind recoiled with suspicion. Why would they feed prisoners so well? What were they fattening them for? The mess hall at Camp Rustin was a long wooden building with rows of picnic-style tables and a serving line where American cooks dished out portions that seemed impossibly generous to women who remembered the starvation rations of wartime Germany. This morning, like every morning, the smell of breakfast filled the compound hours before the women were allowed to enter. Sergeant Tommy Wright stood at the griddle whistling while he worked. He was 45 years old, stocky and solid, with the permanent sunburn of a man who had spent his life working outdoors. Before the war, he had run a cattle ranch outside Austin, Texas. Every Sunday, he would smoke brisket for 14 hours and feed his ranch hands like they were family. When Pearl Harbor happened, he enlisted. But the Army had different plans for a man who could cook like Tommy Wright. Now he flipped bacon on an industrial griddle, watching the fat pop and sizzle and smoke. The sound was almost musical, a rhythm of meat and heat and grease that had been the same whether he was cooking for cowboys in Texas or soldiers in Louisiana. The bacon strips were thick-cut the way he preferred them. The edges curled and crisped while the center stayed meaty and substantial. Fat dripped onto the griddle and immediately vaporized into smoke that carried the scent of salt and pork and hickory across the entire compound. Next to the griddle, eggs waited to be cracked. Biscuits baked in the oven, rising and browning and filling the kitchen with the smell of warm yeast. Coffee percolated in a huge urn, the rich aroma mixing with everything else. A young German woman walked past the kitchen window and stopped. Her name was Frida, and she was 19 years old. She had been working as a clerk in occupied France when the war ended. Now she stood outside the kitchen, her stomach growling so loudly she was sure the American cook could hear it. Wright looked up and saw her. He smiled. "Hungry, miss?" he called out. "Got plenty. Fresh bacon, eggs, biscuits." Frida hesitated. She had been raised on the propaganda about Americans. She had seen the films, read the pamphlets, heard the stories. But the smell of that bacon was making her lightheaded with hunger. And the American sergeant was looking at her with nothing but friendly concern. She stepped closer to the window. Wright used his spatula to lift a strip of bacon from the griddle. It was perfect. Crispy on the edges, glistening with fat, still sizzling. He put it on a plate along with 2 eggs and a biscuit that was so fresh it was still steaming. "Here you go," he said, handing her the plate through the window. "Eat up." Frida took the plate with trembling hands. She looked down at the bacon. Up close, she could see every detail, the way the fat had rendered and crisped, the tiny bubbles in the meat where moisture had cooked away, the deep brown color that spoke of proper heat and proper timing. She picked up the bacon with her fingers. It was still hot enough to sting slightly. She raised it to her mouth and took a bite. The texture was the first thing. That initial crunch as her teeth broke through the crispy exterior, followed immediately by the tender, meaty interior. Then came the taste, salt and smoke and pork fat, rich and savory, and utterly unlike anything she had eaten in months, maybe years. The war had stolen good food from Germany long before it stole anything else. Frida's eyes filled with tears, not from sadness, but from the shock of something tasting this good. From the memory it triggered of her father's farm in Bavaria before the war, when Sunday breakfast meant fresh eggs and meat from their own pigs and bread from the village baker. Wright watched her reaction and nodded with satisfaction. "That's real Texas bacon," he said. "None of that thin nonsense. Proper thick cut, proper smoke." From across the compound, Catherine Weber watched this exchange with narrow eyes. She saw Frida take the food, saw her eat it, saw her cry, and Kat's hand moved to the pamphlet in her pocket, gripping it tightly. Poison, she thought, or fattening us for experiments. Why else would they feed prisoners like this? But Frida didn't look like she was being poisoned. She looked like she was being fed, and that was somehow more disturbing than any amount of cruelty could have been. If this story moves you, if you remember what it was like when the war ended and the world began to change, please share your memories in the comments below. If you or your family served during this time, your stories matter. They remind us that history isn't just dates and battles. It's people. It's moments. It's the smell of bacon on a September morning in Louisiana. But for Catherine Weber and the women of Barrack 7, those propaganda lies weren't just memories. They were about to become a matter of life and death. That afternoon, Kat returned to Barrack 7 and began unpacking the few belongings that had survived the journey from Germany. Most of what she owned had been lost when Berlin fell. What remained fit into a small canvas bag, a few items of clothing, a photograph of her family, and the pamphlet. She pulled it out and unfolded it slowly. The paper was thin and cheap, but the illustrations were vivid. She had seen this pamphlet dozens of times before, distributed by the Reich Ministry of Propaganda in the final years of the war. It was designed to convince German soldiers and civilians that capture by the Americans would be worse than death. And it had worked. Kat believed every word, every image, every lie. The pamphlet showed American doctors in white coats standing over German prisoners. The prisoners were strapped to tables, their faces contorted in agony. Needles and surgical instruments were prominently displayed. The text claimed that American military medicine was conducting experiments on live subjects. that prisoners were being used to test new drugs, new surgical techniques, new weapons, that it was better to die fighting than to fall into American hands. Kat folded the pamphlet carefully and slid it under her mattress. She would look at it again tonight before she slept, and tomorrow night, and every night after that, because she needed to remember, needed to stay vigilant, needed to never ever trust the smiling faces and the generous food and the comfortable beds. In 2 weeks, that pamphlet would almost kill her, but it would also lead to something neither she nor the Americans could have imagined. But first, let me tell you about a Texas cowboy named Tommy Wright and the breakfast that changed everything. Before the war, Tommy Wright's ranch sat on 300 acres of Texas hill country where the grass grew sweet and the cattle grazed fat and happy. His father had built the ranch from nothing, and he had taught Tommy two things above all else: how to cook brisket that would make a grown man cry, and how to treat people. You judge a man by how he treats folks who can't do nothing for him, his father used to say. That's when you see who he really is. Tommy carried that lesson with him when he enlisted after Pearl Harbor. He expected to fight, expected to see combat, expected maybe to die in some foreign land defending freedom and democracy and the American way of life. Instead, the Army took one look at his background and assigned him to food service. For 3 years, he had cooked for soldiers heading to the front lines. He had served them their last meals before they shipped out. He had fed them when they came back wounded and traumatized and broken. Now at Camp Ruston, he cooked for prisoners, and he approached it exactly the same way he had approached everything else: with integrity, with care, with the understanding that food was more than just fuel. It was comfort. It was memory. It was sometimes the only kindness a person might receive all day. The kitchen at Camp Ruston was his domain. Industrial-sized griddles and ovens and refrigerators filled with more food than most of these German women had seen in years. Tommy took pride in every meal he prepared. The bacon had to be perfect. The eggs had to be cooked right. The biscuits had to be light and fluffy and served hot. A young guard named Miller leaned against the kitchen counter watching Tommy work. "Sarge," he said, "why you treat these krauts so nice? They killed our boys." Tommy didn't look up from the bacon he was turning. "My daddy taught me something," he said. "You can't hate someone you've broken bread with. Once you've sat down and eaten together, shared food, shared that moment of being human together, it's a lot harder to see them as the enemy." He flipped the last strip of bacon and set down his spatula. "These women are prisoners. They're hungry. I got food. Simple as that." Miller shook his head but didn't argue. Tommy Wright had a reputation in the camp. The men respected him because he was fair and hardworking and treated everyone with the same steady courtesy, whether they were American soldiers or German prisoners. Tommy turned his attention to the next task. This weekend, he was planning something special: a real Texas barbecue for the entire women's compound. He would smoke brisket for 14 hours over hickory wood, make his grandmother's coleslaw recipe, bake cornbread from scratch, serve it all with ice-cold Coca-Cola. He had mentioned the plan to the camp commander, who had raised an eyebrow but ultimately approved it. "You think that's a good idea?" the commander had asked. "After everything." Especially after everything, Tommy had replied, because Tommy Wright understood something that the propaganda on both sides had tried to obscure: that the war might be over, but the real battle was just beginning. The battle to prove that America was better than the regimes it had defeated. That freedom and democracy and human dignity weren't just words, but actual values that meant something even when dealing with former enemies. He started preparing the brisket, rubbing it with a mixture of salt and pepper and paprika and garlic powder. His hands moved with practiced ease, coating every inch of the meat. Tomorrow this would go into the smoker. 14 hours later, it would be fall apart tender, rich with smoke, the fat rendered into juice that would make the meat glisten. The door to the kitchen opened and Frida appeared hesitant. "Excuse me," she said in heavily accented English. "I wanted to say thank you. For breakfast." Tommy smiled at her. "You're welcome, miss. You settling in okay?" Frida nodded. Then she looked around the kitchen at all the food, all the supplies, the abundance that seemed impossible after years of wartime rationing. "Why?" she asked. "Why you are so kind." Tommy considered the question. He could give her the simple answer: because it's my job, because I'm supposed to, because the Geneva Convention says so. But he gave her the true answer instead. Because kindness don't cost nothing, he said. And because I believe in treating people the way I'd want to be treated. War's over, miss. Time to start acting like it. Frida stood there for a moment processing this. Then she nodded and left. Tommy went back to his brisket, rubbing the spices into the meat with steady, patient movements. He didn't know it yet, but in less than 2 weeks his insistence on kindness would save a woman's life. Not because of what he cooked, but because of what he represented. Hope, decency, the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the propaganda had been wrong. Catherine Weber sat on her bunk in Barracks 7 watching the late afternoon light slant through the windows. 2 other women shared this section with her. Margaret Hoffman, who everyone called Greta, was a 35-year-old nurse who had served on the Eastern Front. She had seen things that gave her nightmares, done things that haunted her, saved lives that made it all worthwhile. Anna Schmidt was 26 younger than both of them, a former clerk who spoke the best English of the 3. They had formed an unlikely friendship during the chaos of surrender and transport. Now they sat together most evenings speaking in Low German about their lost homeland and the families they had not heard from in months. I don't trust them, Kat said, watching American guards walk past the window. The food is too good. The beds are too comfortable. They're planning something. Greta sighed. She had heard this before. Or maybe they're just following the rules for prisoner treatment, she said. Kat pulled out the propaganda pamphlet and held it up. You think the rules matter to people who would do this? She asked. Greta looked at the lurid illustrations and felt a familiar exhaustion. She had been a nurse long enough to know what real medical care looked like versus what propaganda claimed it looked like. But she also understood Kat's fear. They had all been raised on these lies. Untangling truth from fiction was harder than it should have been. Anna spoke up, her voice quiet. The bacon this morning, she said. It tasted real, not fake, not poisoned, just real bacon. Because they want us to trust them, Kat snapped. Then they'll do whatever they're planning. But the certainty in her voice was starting to crack just a little. Because every day they spent at Camp Ruston, every meal they ate, every kindness they received made it harder to maintain the fear that propaganda had instilled in them. That night, Kat lay in her bunk and looked at the pamphlet one more time before sliding it back under her mattress. Outside, the Louisiana crickets sang their endless symphony. The air smelled of pine and magnolia. Somewhere in the distance, a radio played soft music. Kat closed her eyes and tried to sleep. She didn't know that in 2 weeks she would be dying, that Greta would be performing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, that 40 women would form a human wall to protect her from the very people trying to save her life. She didn't know that everything she believed was about to be tested in the most profound way possible. All she knew was that the bacon had tasted good, and that frightened her more than any amount of cruelty ever could. Because if the Americans were kind, if they were decent, if they were human, then what did that say about everything Germany had told them? What did it say about the war? What did it say about the lies they had been fed for 6 long years? Catherine Weber fell asleep with those questions swirling in her mind, unaware that in 14 days she would stop breathing, and those questions would become a matter of life and death for everyone in Camp Ruston. The story was just beginning, and the real test of American values of human compassion, of the power of mercy over hatred, was still to come. September 10th, 1945. 2 days after Catherine Weber promised herself she would never trust the Americans. Evening roll call. The women of Camp Ruston stood in neat rows outside their barracks, faces turned toward the setting sun. The Louisiana sky was doing what it did every evening, painting itself in shades of orange and pink and purple that none of them had ever seen in Northern Europe. The air was still thick with heat, still sweet with the magnolia, still wrong in 1,000 small ways that reminded them daily they were far from home. An American corporal walked down the line with his clipboard counting heads without really looking at faces. 5550, 657. Just bodies to be tallied. Just numbers to be recorded. Catherine Weber stood between Greta and Anna trying to suppress a cough. It was small, dry, nothing to worry about. Just the Louisiana air irritating her lungs. The humidity was different here, thicker. Her body would adjust. But Greta heard it. And Greta, who had spent 3 years as a nurse treating wounded soldiers on the Eastern Front, recognized the sound of something beginning. After roll call, after the corporal had counted to 347 and walked away satisfied, Greta pulled Kat aside. How long have you had that cough? She asked. Few days, Kat said, waving it off. It's nothing. The air here is too wet. My lungs don't like it. Greta reached out and touched Kat's forehead with the back of her hand. The skin was warm. Too warm. You have a fever, Greta said. I'm fine. Let me look at you. In the barracks. Please. Kat wanted to refuse, but the concern in Greta's eyes was genuine, and they had been through too much together for Kat to dismiss it entirely. She nodded. Inside Barracks 7, Greta made Kat sit on her bunk while she performed a quick examination. No medical equipment, no thermometer, no stethoscope, just her hands and her eyes and her years of training. She checked Kat's pulse. Fast. She looked at her eyes, slightly glassy. She listened to her breathing, shallow and rapid. This is more than just irritation from the air, Greta said. You need to see the camp doctor. No. The word came out flat and final. Kat, this could be serious. I said no. Greta sat back frustrated. She understood the fear. She had seen the same propaganda films, read the same pamphlets. But she had also spent 3 years watching people die from treatable infections because they waited too long to get help. At least let me keep an eye on it, Greta said. Promise me that much. Kat nodded reluctantly. Over the next 3 days, the cough got worse. By September 13th, it was no longer dry. It was wet and productive, bringing up phlegm that Kat tried to hide from everyone except Greta. By September 14th, she was coughing so hard at night that she woke up the women in the bunks around her. By September 15th, her fever had climbed high enough that her nightshirt was soaked through with sweat every morning. Greta did what she could with nothing. She made Kat drink water constantly, trying to keep her hydrated. She begged extra blankets from other women to keep Kat warm through the fever chills. She stayed awake at night, watching Kat's breathing, terrified each time it became shallow and labored. Anna helped however she could. She brought Kat's meals from the dining hall, trying to coax her to eat even when Kat had no appetite. She sat with her during the worst coughing fits, holding her upright so she could breathe. The other women in the barracks noticed but said nothing. In the strange hierarchy of the prison camp, you didn't interfere in someone else's business unless asked. Everyone had their own struggles. Everyone was fighting their own private war with memory and loss and uncertainty. For 5 days, Greta managed to keep Kat's condition hidden from the camp authorities. The daily roll calls were conducted quickly, just a head count. As long as Kat could stand upright for 5 minutes twice a day, the guards didn't look too closely. The work assignments were light, mostly cleaning duties, laundry, kitchen, help. Greta and Anna covered for Kat, doing her share along with their own. But Kat was dying. Greta knew it with the certainty of her medical training. The fever was constant now, burning at 104 degrees. The cough had turned wet and productive, bringing up blood-streaked phlegm. Kat's breathing came in short, gasping pants. Her lips had taken on a bluish tint from lack of oxygen. She was drowning in the fluid in her own lungs, and without antibiotics, without oxygen, without real medical care, there was nothing Greta could do. September 16th. Morning, 6 days after the cough started. Kat woke up coughing so violently that she couldn't stop. Her whole body convulsed with it. She grabbed for her pillowcase, pressing it against her mouth, trying to muffle the sound. When the fit finally passed, she pulled the pillowcase away and looked at it. Blood. Not just streaks this time. Dark red splotches against the white fabric, stark and undeniable. Greta saw it from across the barracks and felt her heart drop into her stomach. She crossed the room in 3 strides and took the pillowcase from Kat's trembling hands. This is hemoptysis, Greta said quietly. Advanced pneumonia. Fluid in your lungs. Without treatment, Kat, you have days, maybe hours. Anna appeared beside them, saw the blood and put her hand over her mouth. We have to tell the Americans, Anna said. We have to get help, now. No, Kat whispered. Her voice was weak but determined. Please, I'd rather die. Greta looked at her friend's face and saw genuine terror there. This wasn't stubbornness. This wasn't pride. This was fear so deep and so absolute that death seemed preferable to the alternative. She made me promise, Greta said to Anna later that day when they were alone in the latrine where no one could hear them. She begged me, said she'd rather die than let the Americans experiment on her. Anna gripped the edge of the sink, her knuckles white. Do you believe it, she asked? The propaganda, the experiments? Greta was silent for a long moment. I don't know, she finally said. I don't know what to believe anymore, but I know Kat is dying, and I don't know how to save her. While Catherine Weber's lungs filled with fluid in a Louisiana barracks, while Greta Hoffman wrestled with an impossible choice while Anna Schmidt tried to hold together a situation that was falling apart, Captain Robert Brennan sat alone in his office at the base hospital. It was late afternoon. The Louisiana sun slanted through his window, painting everything gold. On his desk sat a journal leather-bound and worn from constant use. Brennan opened it and began to write. September 16, 1945. 3 months since VE Day. I've saved 127 lives since arriving at Camp Ruston. Pneumonia infections, injuries, things that would have killed people a decade ago, but are treatable now with penicillin and proper care. 127 lives. But I couldn't save Danny. He stopped writing and picked up the photograph that sat beside his journal. Two young men in uniform, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. Robert and Daniel Brennan. Brothers, best friends, two boys from Boston who had enlisted together to fight fascism and make the world safe. The memory came whether he wanted it or not. It always did. Omaha Beach, June 6, 1944. The sound of machine gun fire and artillery and men screaming. Danny running across the sand trying to reach wounded soldiers who were pinned down by German fire. Robert serving as a field medic, watching his brother from 50 yards away. Watching him get hit. Watching him fall. Watching him die while Robert was physically held back by other soldiers who knew that running to him would just mean two dead Brennan brothers instead of one. Danny's eyes had met his across that distance. Just for a second. And then he was gone. Brennan closed his eyes against the memory. When he opened them again, he looked down at the journal and wrote one more line. Every life I save from here on is for you, Danny. Every single one. That's my promise. That's my purpose. That's how I make your death mean something. He didn't know that in 6 days he would face a test of that vow, unlike anything he could imagine. That he would stand in a barracks doorway, looking at a wall of terrified women and a dying prisoner, and have to find a way to bridge a gap built from years of propaganda and lies. He closed the journal and went back to work. September 17th through September 20, 3 days of deterioration. Kat's condition spiraled. Her fever remained constant at 104 degrees. Her breathing became increasingly labored. She could no longer lie flat because it felt like drowning. She had to sleep sitting up, propped against the wall, fighting for each breath. The blue tint spread from her lips to her fingernails. Her skin took on a grayish pallor. She stopped eating entirely. Water was all she could manage, and even that sometimes triggered coughing fits so violent that she would vomit. On work detail, Greta and Anna hauled laundry baskets that should have been shared among 3 people. They scrubbed floors on their knees, exhausted and terrified. They did Kat's share and their own, and tried not to think about what would happen when Kat couldn't even stand for roll call anymore. Other women watched but didn't comment. A few offered help in small ways. An extra blanket. A cup of water brought to Kat's bunk. A quiet prayer in the night. But no one suggested calling the Americans, because they all knew what Kat believed, and most of them believed it too. September 20th, the day before the collapse. At the guard station, Sergeant Tommy Wright was preparing for the weekend barbecue. He had been smoking a brisket since 4 that morning. 14 hours over hickory wood, low and slow, the way his father had taught him. The smell rolled across the compound, rich and deep and impossible to ignore. He also had a cooler full of ice and Coca-Cola bottles. The glass bottles sweated in the Louisiana heat condensation dripping onto the metal sides of the cooler. The ice clinked when he moved the cooler into position. A young guard named Miller was helping him set up the picnic tables. Sarge Miller said, "You really going to give the Krauts Coca-Cola right?" Opened one of the bottles with a metal opener. The sound was distinctive. That sharp hiss and pop as the cap released and carbonation rushed out. Foam cascaded down the neck of the bottle. Wright took a long drink and sighed with satisfaction. "Son," he said, "I've traveled from Texas to France to Germany. You know what I learned? Everybody likes Coca-Cola. It's the one thing that doesn't need translation." He set the bottle down and looked out across the compound toward the women's barracks. "These women have been told their whole lives that we're monsters," he said, "that America is cruel and violent and savage. Words aren't going to change that. But maybe bacon and brisket and ice-cold Coke will show them something different." Miller shook his head, but smiled. "You're an optimist, Sarge." Wright smiled back. "I'm a Texan. Same thing." At that moment, a young German woman named Frida walked past the guard station. She had been the one who accepted bacon from Wright that first morning. Now she stopped at the sound of the Coca-Cola bottle opening. That distinctive hiss, that fizz. She remembered that sound from before the war. A party in Berlin in 1938. She had been 14 years old. Someone had smuggled in Coca-Cola, a luxury even then. She remembered the taste, sweet and cold and unlike anything else in the world. Wright saw her stop and held out a bottle. "Want one, Miss Ice Cold?" Frida approached slowly as if approaching a wild animal that might bolt. She took the bottle from his hand. The glass was so cold it almost hurt to hold. Condensation ran down the sides and dripped onto her fingers. She raised it to her lips and took a sip. The sensation hit her all at once. The icy cold, the carbonation fizzing on her tongue, the sweet vanilla caramel taste that was exactly like she remembered, and also somehow different, richer, more complex. Tears filled her eyes. Wright watched her reaction with understanding. He had seen this before. The power of something simple to break through walls that words could never touch. "It's good, isn't it?" he said gently. Frida nodded, unable to speak. She took another sip, then another. And as she drank, she thought about propaganda and lies and the question that had been building in her mind for weeks. If they give us this, she thought, if they give us bacon and brisket and ice-cold Coca-Cola, what else were we lied to about September 21st? Evening, 24 hours before Catherine Weber would stop breathing. Inside Barracks 7, Kat sat propped against the wall, struggling for each breath. Her face was gray. Her eyes were glassy with fever. She looked like a ghost of herself. Greta knelt beside her, checking her pulse. It was rapid and thready, 130 beats per minute. Her breathing was worse than it had ever been. Short, gasping pants with a horrible wet rattle in her chest. Kat, Greta said quietly, "I'm begging you, let me ask the Americans for antibiotics. They don't even have to see you. I'll say they're for me. I'll lie." Kat used what little energy she had left to speak. "And when they see you're not sick," she whispered, "they'll know. They'll come for me. Then I'll say I have an infection somewhere else. I'll make something up." "Greta, no." Kat's hand found Greta's and gripped it weakly. "I won't let you become one of their test subjects because of me." Anna, who had been sitting silently on the next bunk, finally spoke up. "This is insane," she said. Her voice was shaking. "You're dying over a lie." "How do you know it's a lie?" Kat asked. The silence that followed was heavy and oppressive, because none of them knew. Not really. They had been told their entire lives that Americans were monsters. They had seen the films, read the pamphlets, heard the stories from people they trusted. How could they know what was true and what was propaganda? That was the horrible power of it. Propaganda didn't just make you believe lies. It made you doubt your own ability to recognize truth. As night fell over camp, Rustin, Greta, and Anna sat beside Kat's bunk watching her breathe, counting each breath, knowing that tomorrow might be the last day, knowing that they had a choice to make and no good options. Greta thought about her medical training, about the oath she had taken to do no harm, about the patients she had saved and the ones she had lost, about the fine line between respecting someone's wishes and letting them die unnecessarily. Anna thought about friendship and loyalty and the question of when love means honoring someone's choices and when it means overruling them for their own good. And Kat, in her fever dream state, thought about the propaganda films she had seen, the pamphlet under her mattress, the absolute certainty she had felt weeks ago that Americans were monsters, and the small growing doubt that maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong. September 22nd, 1945, afternoon roll call. The Louisiana sun blazed down on the compound. Heat waves rose from the ground, making the air shimmer. The women stood in their usual neat rows, waiting to be counted. Catherine Weber stood between Greta and Anna. She was swaying on her feet. Her vision kept blurring. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Each breath was a battle she was losing. The American corporal walked down the line with his clipboard. 55, 56, 57, not looking at faces, just counting bodies. Kat's knees started to buckle. Greta caught her immediately, wrapping both arms around her waist. Anna grabbed her other side. They held her upright between them. "Ich hab dich," Greta whispered in German. "I've got you. Just a few more seconds." The corporal looked up at the commotion. "Everything okay there?" Anna forced a smile. She is fine, she said in heavily accented English. Just hot day. Very hot. The corporal shrugged and went back to counting. 58, 59, 60. As soon as he dismissed them, Greta and Anna half-carried, half-dragged Kat back to the barracks. Her feet left marks in the dust. Other women watched but didn't interfere. Inside Barracks 7, they laid Kat on her bunk. She was barely conscious. Her breathing had deteriorated into a horrible, rattling, bubbling sound. Each breath sounded like she was drowning, which she was, in the fluid that filled her lungs. "We have to get help," Anna said. Her voice was breaking with panic. "Greta, she's dying. Look at her." "I know," Greta said. Tears were running down her face. "But she made me promise. She said she'd rather die." "And what if she does die?" Anna grabbed Greta's shoulders, forcing her to make eye contact. "What if we just sit here and watch her die because we're too scared to ask for help?" They sat there frozen by indecision. Around them, the other women in the barracks went about their evening routines. Some wrote letters, some played cards, some just lay on their bunks, staring at the ceiling. Everyone knew what was happening in the corner bunk. But no one said anything. It wasn't their business. And besides, they understood. They had all heard the same propaganda. If Kat would rather die than submit to American medical experiments, well, that was her choice. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 6:30. At 7 o'clock exactly, Catherine Weber stopped breathing. Just stopped. Her chest went still. Her lips turned blue. The awful rattling sound ceased, replaced by silence more terrible than any noise. Greta screamed. It was a raw animal sound of pure terror. She put her ear to Kat's chest, listening desperately for a heartbeat. There, faint but present. Her heart was still beating. But she wasn't breathing. Greta did the only thing she could. She tilted Kat's head back, pinched her nose, and breathed into her mouth. Once, twice, 3 times. Kat's chest rose and fell with her enforced air, but she didn't start breathing on her own. "Get help!" Greta screamed at Anna between breaths. "Run! Get the Americans! I don't care anymore!" "Just get help!" Anna ran. She burst out of the barracks and sprinted toward the guard station. The Louisiana twilight was beautiful, painted in shades of purple and gold. She didn't notice. She was screaming in broken English. "Help, Dr. Woman dying." "Please help." Behind her in the barracks, something happened. The other German women gathered around Kat's bunk, without any discussion, without any planning. Just a collective instinct born from years of propaganda and fear, and the belief that they had to protect their own from the monsters in American uniforms. They formed a human wall, 3 rows deep, 40 women shoulder to shoulder. Their faces were hard, hostile, afraid, tearful. They picked up whatever they could find to use as weapons: broom handles, metal cups, a chair leg, a curtain rod, and they began to chant, "Rühr sie nicht an." Don't touch her. Sie stirbt. She's dying. Rühr sie nicht an. Don't touch her. One of the older women, a woman named Ingrid, who was 50 years old and had lost everyone she loved in the war, spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "They will not experiment on her," she said. "We will die protecting her if we must. They are animals." The chant grew louder. 5 minutes after Anna ran for help, footsteps pounded toward the barracks. Running, urgent. The doors burst open. 3 Americans in medical uniforms stood in the doorway. Captain Robert Brennan still had his dinner napkin tucked into his collar. He held a medical kit. Behind him stood Corporal Grace Tanaka, small and unthreatening, and Corporal James Delgado, stocky and determined. They saw the wall. 40 women, weapons raised, faces twisted with fear and rage, chanting in German and broken English. "Don't touch her. She's dying. Leave her alone. You will not experiment on her. Get away, don't come closer." Behind the wall, visible in glimpses, Greta was still performing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on Kat's motionless body. Brennan raised his hands, palms out. "We're here to help," he said clearly, loudly. "We're doctors. We want to help your friend." "Liar," someone shouted in German. Another woman translated into English. "You want to use her? Experiment. We know what you do." Brennan could see Kat's blue lips from where he stood. He could hear the wet rattle when Greta forced air into her lungs. He could see that this woman was minutes, maybe seconds from death. "Please," he said. He took one step forward. The women surged toward him, raising their makeshift weapons. He stopped. "Please," he said again. "I'm a doctor. I've taken an oath to help people. I don't want to hurt your friend. I want to save her. But I can't do that from over here." Corporal Delgado leaned close and whispered, "Sir, we could call for backup. Get guards in here to move them." "No," Brennan said immediately. "That will make it worse. Look at them. They're terrified. If we force our way in, they'll never trust us. And that woman will die while we're fighting our way through." He turned to Grace Tanaka. "Grace, you try. Maybe they'll listen to another woman." Corporal Grace Tanaka stepped forward. She was 24 years old and barely 5 feet tall. She had a round face and gentle eyes. She looked completely non-threatening, which was exactly what Brennan was counting on. Grace set down her medical kit and raised her empty hands. She spoke in English, but slowly, clearly, hoping they would understand at least some of it. "My name is Grace. I'm a nurse. I have medicine that can help your friend. Please let me try." The women didn't move, but they stopped shouting. That was something. Grace tried again. She pointed to her medical kit. "Medicine," she said. Then she made a gesture of someone breathing easily. "Help her breathe. Save her life." She placed both hands over her heart. "Please," she said. "Trust me. I want to help." Anna stood at the front of the group of women. She had been watching Grace's face during this whole exchange, and what she saw there didn't look like cruelty or deception. It looked like genuine concern, genuine desperation. This American woman looked like she truly wanted to help. Anna turned to the women behind her and spoke rapidly in German. "Look at her face," she said. "She's not lying, and Kat is dying right now in the next few minutes. We can let her die to protect her from something that might not even be real, or we can take a chance." Someone shouted back, "They'll hurt her." Anna shouted louder, "She's already dead if we do nothing. Look at Greta. Look how exhausted she is. Kat hasn't breathed on her own in 6 minutes. This is her only chance." The women looked at each other. Fear fought with hope in their eyes. Years of propaganda fought with the desperate desire to save their friend. Finally, slowly, the wall began to part. Just a narrow gap at first, then wider. Grace stepped toward the gap, and then an older woman, Ingrid, grabbed her arm. Her grip was like iron. She spoke in German, but her meaning was clear from her tone and the way she held Grace's arm. "A warning, a threat." Anna translated. "She says if you hurt her, if you do experiments, if you cause her pain, we will kill you. All of us. We don't care what happens to us. We will kill you." Grace looked Ingrid directly in the eyes. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. "I understand," she said. "If I hurt her, you can kill me, but I won't hurt her. I promise." For a long moment, Ingrid searched Grace's face, looking for deception, looking for cruelty, looking for any sign that the propaganda had been true. She found only truth. Ingrid released Grace's arm slowly. The gap in the wall widened. Grace walked through. Behind her, Brennan and Delgado followed, carrying their equipment. The wall closed behind them. Now the Americans were surrounded, trapped inside the circle of 40 terrified women. If things went wrong, there would be no easy escape. Brennan knelt beside the bunk. He didn't need more than 10 seconds to make his diagnosis. "Severe pneumonia," he said quietly. "Probably bacterial. Complete respiratory failure. Pulse is thready and weak. She's minutes from death." He looked up at his team. "Danny, start an IV," he said. "Normal saline wide open. Grace, I need the intubation kit now." Then he turned to Greta, who was still kneeling beside Kat, exhausted and desperate. "Please," she whispered in English. It was perhaps the only English word she knew. Brennan placed his hand on her shoulder, gently moving her aside. "You did good," he said softly. "You did real good keeping her alive this long. Now let me help." And as Greta collapsed into Anna's arms, as 40 German women watched with weapons still raised, as Catherine Weber's heart beat its last few beats before it would either recover or fail forever, Captain Robert Brennan began to fight for a life the way he had fought for 1,000 lives before. Not because she was American, not because she was an ally, not because she deserved it, but because she was human, and because mercy was not weakness. And because the real test of American values wasn't how you treated your friends, it was how you treated your enemies. The battle for Catherine Weber's life had begun, and with it, the battle for 40 women's souls. Brennan's hands moved with the practiced precision of a man who had performed this procedure hundreds of times under conditions far worse than a Louisiana barracks. But his hands were also moving with urgency because he could see the clock ticking in Catherine Weber's failing body. Her lips were the color of storm clouds. Her fingernails had gone purple. Her skin had taken on a waxy grayish pallor that he recognized from 3 years of treating dying soldiers. "Jimmy, start an IV," he said. "Left arm. Normal saline wide open." Corporal Delgado knelt on the opposite side of the bunk and began searching for a vein in Kat's dehydrated arm. His fingers moved gently over her skin, palpating feeling for the subtle ridge that would indicate a blood vessel large enough to accept the needle. The German women watched in absolute silence. They had expected rough handling. They had expected pain. They had expected the brutal efficiency of people who saw prisoners as objects rather than humans. Instead, they saw Delgado's fingers moving with the same careful gentleness a man might use touching a newborn baby. "Got it," Delgado said quietly. He slid the needle into the vein with one smooth motion. There was a small flash of blood in the chamber, confirming placement. He secured the line with tape, connected the saline bag, and hung it on the bunk post above Kat's head. The IV line began to flow, clear fluid running into Kat's collapsed veins. "Life in liquid form. She's lost maybe 10% of her body weight in fluids," Delgado said to Brennan. "Severely dehydrated. She needs at least 2 liters. Run it wide open," Brennan replied. While Delgado worked the IV, Brennan prepared for intubation. Grace handed him the laryngoscope, a metal instrument that looked vaguely medieval to the watching women. Several of them tensed, gripping their makeshift weapons tighter. "This is how they do it," one woman whispered in German. "This is how they hurt you." But Anna, who was watching Brennan's face, saw something that made her doubt. She saw sweat on his forehead. She saw the tight set of his jaw. She saw the way his eyes never left Kat's face, constantly monitoring, constantly assessing. She saw a man who looked like he was fighting a battle he desperately wanted to win. Brennan tilted Kat's head back into what he called the sniffing position. He inserted the laryngoscope blade gently, slowly, visualizing her vocal cords. Even unconscious, even dying, Kat's body tried to resist the foreign object. Her throat gagged reflexively. "Easy," Brennan murmured. "I know it feels wrong, but it's keeping you alive." He threaded the endotracheal tube through her vocal cords and into her trachea. Once it was positioned correctly, he inflated the small cuff that would hold it in place and prevent it from slipping. There was a soft hiss of air as the cuff expanded. Grace immediately attached the ambu bag to the end of the tube. She began squeezing it rhythmically. Hiss, click, hiss, click. The sound filled the barracks, air being forced into Kat's lungs, oxygen being delivered to tissues that were starving for it. Kat's chest rose and fell with each squeeze of the bag, but it wasn't her own breathing. It was Grace's hands doing the work her lungs could no longer do. The German women stared at the machine like quality of it. The 3 Americans working together with a synchronization that spoke of countless hours of practice. Brennan monitoring everything. Delgado managing the IV. Grace manually ventilating. A triangle of medical professionals who moved like dancers who had performed this routine 1,000 times. "Adrenaline," Brennan said, holding out his hand. Delgado placed a syringe in his palm. Brennan injected it into the IV line. "This will stimulate her heart," he said. "Keep it beating strong while we deal with the infection." He prepared another syringe. This one contained a cloudy white liquid. "Penicillin," he said. 5 years ago, this drug didn't exist. During the war, it saved thousands of soldiers who would have died from infections, just like this one. It's going to save her too." He injected the penicillin slowly into the IV line. One of the watching women whispered to her neighbor in German, "Why is he explaining what he's doing? If he was going to experiment on her, wouldn't he hide it?" The neighbor had no answer. Brennan prepared a third injection. Much smaller this time. "Small dose of morphine," he said. "Not enough to sedate her heavily, just enough to reduce the sensation of air hunger. Make her more comfortable." He administered it and then sat back slightly, his hands finally still for a moment. He looked up at the circle of women surrounding them, at the weapons still held in trembling hands, at the faces still hard with suspicion and fear. "She's stable," he said clearly, "but she needs a real hospital. X-rays, proper oxygen equipment, IV antibiotics around the clock. We need to move her now." No one moved. No one lowered their weapons. Brennan looked directly at Ingrid, the older woman who had threatened Grace. "I give you my word," he said, "as a doctor, as an American officer, as a man, we will not hurt her. We will treat her with the same care we would give to our own soldiers, our own families." Ingrid stared at him, searching his face for deception. And then she looked down at Kat. 3 minutes had passed since Grace had started manually ventilating her. And in those 3 minutes, something remarkable had happened. The blue tint was fading from Kat's lips, slowly, subtly, but undeniably. The purple was leaving her fingernails. Her skin color was shifting from gray toward a pale pink. The oxygen was working, the fluids were working, the medications were working. Ingrid had seen enough death to recognize life when she saw it returning. She lowered her weapon. The other women watched her. The oldest among them, the hardest, the most suspicious. If Ingrid was lowering her weapon, then perhaps, just perhaps, the propaganda had been wrong. One by one, the other weapons lowered. Broom handles clattered to the floor. Metal cups were set down. The human wall didn't disappear, but it softened. The faces remained wary, but the immediate threat of violence had passed. Grace kept squeezing the ambu bag. Hiss, click, hiss, click. 1, 2, 3, breathe. The rhythm was hypnotic, life-sustaining, the sound of a heartbeat externalized. And then, at exactly 7 minutes and 15 seconds after Brennan had begun treatment, Catherine Weber coughed. It was weak, more of a gay than a true cough. But it was her body's own reflex, her own nervous system trying to clear her airway, her own muscles attempting to work. Brennan saw it and allowed himself the smallest smile. "That's it," he said softly, leaning closer to Kat's face. "That's good. Come on. Breathe for me. You can do it." A second cough, stronger this time, and then a third, and then Kat's chest moved on its own. Just a little, just a small, shallow breath that had nothing to do with Grace squeezing the bag. Her eyelids fluttered. They opened slightly, unfocused, clouded with fever and confusion, but open, alive, conscious, breathing. Greta, who had been held back by Anna, broke free and rushed forward. She fell to her knees beside the bunk, sobbing so hard her whole body shook. Not quiet, dignified tears. Huge, racking sobs of relief and gratitude and the release of hours of unbearable tension. Anna grabbed Greta and started crying too. Around them, 40 German women began to weep. Some sat down on the floor, their legs giving out. Others hugged each other. A few just stood there, tears streaming down their faces, unable to process what they had just witnessed. The Americans had not hurt Kat. They had saved her. The propaganda had been wrong. Everything they had been told, everything they had believed, every film they had watched, and every pamphlet they had read had been a lie. Brennan stood and addressed the room. "She's stable enough to transport," he said, "but we need to move her to the hospital immediately. She'll need to stay there for at least a week, maybe 2. We'll take good care of her. You have my word." This time, when the Americans lifted Kat onto the stretcher, no one tried to stop them. The women parted silently, creating a path to the door. Several reached out to touch Kat's hand as she passed, a gesture of blessing or prayer or simply connection. Greta and Anna followed the stretcher out of the barracks. They were not letting Kat out of their sight. Not yet. They had to see this through. Outside, the Louisiana night had fallen completely. Stars blazed overhead, more stars than any of them had ever seen in the light-polluted skies of Europe. The air smelled of pine and magnolia and the distant smoke from Tommy Wright's barbecue preparation. The stretcher was loaded into an ambulance. Greta and Anna climbed in behind it. As the vehicle pulled away, Ingrid stood in the doorway of Barrack 7, watching it disappear into the darkness. If they save her, she thought, if they truly save her without hurting her, then everything I believed for 6 years was a lie. The thought should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt almost like relief. The base hospital was a large, well-lit building that looked nothing like the field hospitals any of them had seen during the war. There were real operating rooms here, real x-ray machines, real equipment that worked, and real supplies that weren't rationed, and real electricity that stayed on all night. Greta and Anna sat in the waiting room on hard wooden benches. They were still in their prisoner uniforms. Around them, American soldiers and nurses moved with purposeful efficiency. A few glanced at the 2 German women, but no one said anything hostile. They were just two more people waiting for news about someone they loved. An hour passed, then another. At 9 o'clock, a nurse approached them. She was older, maybe 45, with gray streaks in her hair and kind eyes. Her name tag said Margaret. "You girls look exhausted," she said. She held out 2 cups of coffee. "Here, on the house." Greta and Anna stared at the cups. Coffee. Real coffee, not the ersatz chicory substitute they had choked down in Germany for years. Steam rose from the dark liquid. "It's just coffee," Margaret said gently. "Maxwell House, sugar and cream on the side if you want it." She sat down beside them and added cream to her own cup, then took a sip. "See safe as houses." Anna picked up a cup with trembling hands. The ceramic was warm against her palms. She raised it to her lips and took a cautious sip. The taste hit her tongue and she almost cried. Rich, strong, slightly bitter with an undertone of sweetness. Real coffee. The kind she remembered from before the war, before rationing, before everything fell apart. Greta tried hers and closed her eyes against the sudden wave of memory. Sunday mornings in her childhood home. Her father reading the newspaper. Her mother making breakfast. Coffee percolating on the stove. A time when the world made sense. Margaret set a plate on the bench between them. "Donuts," she said, fresh from the kitchen. Glazed. The donuts were perfect golden rings, the glaze catching the overhead lights and making them shine. Anna picked one up. It was still slightly warm. She bit into it and felt the slight crunch of the glaze give way to soft, pillowy dough. Sugar coated her lips. The taste was pure sweetness, pure comfort, pure kindness. She started crying again. Not from sadness, from the overwhelming realization that they were being treated like human beings. That these small gestures of coffee and donuts weren't some elaborate trick. They were just kindness. Simple, uncomplicated kindness. "Y'all been through a lot, haven't you?" Margaret said softly. She patted Anna's hand. "Well, you're safe now. And your friend's in good hands. Dr. Brennan is the best we got." At 9:30, Brennan emerged from the emergency ward. He looked tired but satisfied. His scrubs were spotted with blood and other fluids. His stethoscope hung around his neck, but his face showed relief. "She's going to live," he said. Anna translated for Greta. Greta put her face in her hands and sobbed. "The pneumonia is bad," Brennan continued. "Bilateral infiltrates, severe hypoxia. But we caught it just in time. Another hour and I don't know if we could have saved her." He explained the treatment plan. Penicillin every 4 hours, oxygen support for at least 48 hours, chest x-rays to monitor the fluid in her lungs. They would drain some of the fluid tomorrow if needed. She would need to stay in the hospital for at least a week, possibly 2. But she'll make a full recovery, he said. "Can we see her?" Anna asked in halting English. Brennan hesitated. "She's unconscious," he said. "We have her sedated so she doesn't fight the breathing tube. But yes, you can see her, just for a few minutes." He led them down a hallway to a small private room. Inside, Catherine Weber lay in a real hospital bed with clean white sheets. She looked tiny and fragile. The breathing tube was still in her throat, connected to a machine that hissed and clicked rhythmically. IV lines ran into both her arms. An oxygen saturation monitor beeped steadily, showing numbers that meant nothing to Greta and Anna, but everything to the medical staff. Kat's face was peaceful in unconsciousness. The gray pallor was fading as oxygen and fluids worked through her system. Greta approached the bed slowly as if approaching something sacred. She reached out and touched Kat's hand. It was warm, alive. The pulse in her wrist was visible, steady and strong. Greta looked up at Brennan, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you. Thank you." Brennan smiled. "You're welcome," he said. "Now you two need to get some rest. Come back tomorrow." She should be awake by then. When Greta and Anna returned to Camp Ruston at 10 o'clock that night, the entire population of Barrack 7 was waiting. Women mobbed them the moment they walked through the door. Questions erupted in German, overlapping and urgent. "Is Kat alive? What did they do to her? Did they hurt her?" Anna climbed onto a chair so everyone could see and hear her. She told them everything. The hospital, the machines, the medicine, the way the doctors had treated Kat with such careful gentleness. Brennan's face full of genuine concern. How he had fought to save Kat's life, as if she were his own sister. "They didn't hurt her," Anna said, her voice ringing through the barracks. "They saved her." She paused, letting that sink in. "We were wrong," she said. "Everything we were told about the Americans. It was lies, all lies. The barracks erupted in conversation. Some women wanted to believe immediately, relief flooding through them like water through a broken dam. Others were more cautious, more skeptical, the older women especially. They had believed the propaganda for too long to let it go easily. Maybe they're just being nice because we're women, one woman suggested. Maybe they treat the male prisoners differently. Greta spoke up, her voice quiet but cutting. Or maybe she said everything our government told us was a lie. About everything. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. If the Americans weren't monsters, if they were actually honorable people who treated prisoners with dignity and medical care, then what did that say about Germany? What did that say about the war they had just lost? What did that say about the regime they had served? That night, very few women in Barracks 7 slept. They lay in their bunks staring at the ceiling, listening to the Louisiana crickets, thinking about lies and truth and the terrible possibility that they had been on the wrong side all along. The next morning, September 23rd, Catherine Weber woke up in a hospital bed. The first thing she noticed was that breathing didn't hurt. For the first time in almost 2 weeks, she could draw air into her lungs without pain or effort or the terrible sensation of drowning. The second thing she noticed was the white ceiling. Not the wooden slats of the barracks, but smooth white plaster. She turned her head slowly. There was an IV line in her arm, an oxygen mask hanging ready beside the bed, a window showing blue Louisiana sky, and sitting in chairs beside her bed, Greta and Anna. "You let them take me," Kat whispered. Her voice was hoarse and weak from the breathing tube. "I told you not to." Tears formed in her eyes. "I told you what they would do." Greta moved to sit on the edge of the bed. She took Kat's hand. "Look around you," she said gently. "Look at this room. Look at these machines. Look at the medicine they're giving you. Does this look like torture?" Kat looked, really looked, at the IV drip feeding antibiotics into her arm, at the oxygen equipment, at the clean white sheets in the comfortable mattress in the window with real glass, at the monitor beeping steadily, measuring her heartbeat, her oxygen levels, her recovery. "You were dead," Anna said. "Your heart was beating, but you weren't breathing. Another few minutes and you would have been gone. Captain Brennan brought you back. He used medicine we don't have in Germany anymore. He saved you because he's a doctor, and that's what doctors do." Kat closed her eyes. Tears leaked from under her eyelids. "They told us the Americans were animals," she whispered. "They lied," Greta said simply. "About this, maybe about everything." The door opened and Corporal Grace Tanaka entered, carrying a clipboard. She saw that Kat was awake and smiled. "Good morning, Catherine," she said. "How are you feeling?" Kat stared at her. This small Asian woman in an American uniform who had promised not to hurt her and had kept that promise. "Why did you help me?" Kat asked in halting English. "We were enemy." Grace pulled up a chair and sat down. She made a decision in that moment to tell Kat something she rarely shared. "My parents are Japanese," she said, "born in America but Japanese. When the war started, our government put them in a camp, Manzanar in the desert. They lost their flower shop, their home, everything." She paused, making sure Kat understood. "People told lies about them," she continued, "said they were spies, traitors. I know what it's like when propaganda makes people hate you for what you are, not who you are." Kat's eyes widened. "But you are American," she said. "You are soldier." "Yes," Grace said, "and that's the point. America isn't perfect. We make mistakes, we do wrong things, but we try to be better. We try to fix our mistakes. I became a nurse to prove the propaganda wrong. About me, about all of us, and to help people. All people." She touched Kat's hand gently. "You're not my enemy anymore," she said. "The war is over. Now you're just a person who needs help. And helping you makes me a better person. Makes all of us better." Saturday, September 29th. 6 days after Catherine Weber stopped breathing and was brought back to life by the people she had been taught to fear. The outdoor area of the women's compound had been transformed. Picnic tables covered with red check tablecloths, an American flag hanging from a pole, not aggressive or intimidating, just present. And at the center of everything, Tommy Wright's smoker, billowing hickory smoke into the clear Louisiana sky. The brisket had been smoking since 4 that morning. 14 hours over low heat, the hickory wood burning slow and steady. The smell rolled across the compound, so rich and deep and complex that it made the women stop whatever they were doing and just breathe it in. Wright stood at the serving station grinning. Behind him, platters of meat waited, brisket, ribs, chicken, side dishes in huge bowls, coleslaw, beans, cornbread, and on a table to the side, a cooler full of ice with Coca-Cola bottles nestled in it, condensation dripping down the metal sides. Ladies, Wright called out, "Welcome to a proper Texas barbecue. Don't be shy now. Plenty for everyone." The women approached hesitantly at first, but the smell was overwhelming. Smoking meat, caramelizing fat, fresh baked cornbread, the sweet molasses scent of beans. Their stomachs overruled their caution. Frida was first in line. Wright loaded her plate with thick slices of brisket, the meat so tender it fell apart at the touch of his tongs. He added ribs, the bones showing through meat that had been cooked to perfection. "You want ribs, miss," he said. "You gotta eat 'em with your hands. Don't be polite. That's the whole point." He demonstrated picking up a rib and tearing into it with his teeth. Meat fell off the bone, barbecue sauce gleamed on his lips. Frida laughed, actually laughed, for the first time in months, maybe years. She picked up a rib and bit into it. The texture was incredible. The slight char on the outside giving way to tender, smoky meat inside. The fat had rendered perfectly, making each bite melt in her mouth. The barbecue sauce was sweet and tangy, and just spicy enough to make her tongue tingle. She closed her eyes and made a sound of pure pleasure. "That's it," Wright said, delighted. "Now you got it." At the Coca-Cola station, Anna opened a bottle. That distinctive hiss and pop. Carbonation rushing out, foam cascading down the glass neck. She raised it to her lips. The sensation was everything she remembered and more. Ice cold hitting her throat, bubbles fizzing, the sweet vanilla caramel taste that was pure America, pure freedom, pure possibility. She turned to the other women and said in German, "It tastes like hope." One by one they tried it. The Coca-Cola, the brisket, the ribs, the cornbread. And one by one they began to understand something that propaganda had tried to hide from them. That the enemy was just people. That Americans were just people. That on the other side of war and hatred and lies, there was just humanity shared and simple and profound. October 5th, Catherine Weber was discharged from the hospital after 12 days of treatment. She walked back into Barrack 7 looking like a different person. She had gained weight. Her face had color. She could breathe without pain or effort. She looked healthy, alive, whole. The women welcomed her with cheers and tears and embraces that threatened to squeeze all the air back out of her lungs. When the celebration calmed, Kat stood in the center of the barracks and spoke. "I was wrong," she said. The room went quiet. "I was wrong about the Americans. They saved my life. They used medicine I didn't even know existed. They treated me with kindness and respect. The nurses checked on me every hour. The doctors explained everything they were doing. They asked my permission before procedures. They treated me like a human being." Her voice broke slightly. "I would have died believing a lie. I would have died hating people who didn't deserve hatred. I would have died without ever knowing that the enemy I feared was actually trying to save me." If you've served in the military during this time, or if your family members encountered former prisoners of war after the war ended, we would love to hear your story. Share your memories in the comments, because these stories matter. They remind us that even in the darkest times, humanity can prevail, and that the hardest walls to tear down are the ones we build in our own minds. December 1945. Letters from home finally began arriving with regularity. Catherine Weber received one from her sister in Munich. She read it sitting on her bunk, her hands trembling. Her father had been killed in a bombing raid. Her mother and sister were living in a basement with 6 other families. One room, one blanket shared between them. Food was so scarce they made soup from grass and considered it a feast. Kat looked around the barracks. 3 meals a day, a warm bed, medical care, safety. Her family was starving in ruins while she, the prisoner, lived in relative comfort. The guilt was crushing. Guilt. She went to Captain Brennan and asked if there was any way to send food or supplies to her family. He shook his head sadly. "The mail system barely works," he said. "Packages don't get through. The best thing you can do is write to them. Let them know you're alive and safe. That gives them hope." He paused, then shared something personal. My brother Danny died at Normandy, he said. Every day I wonder why I survived, and he didn't. But I decided that I honor him by living, by saving lives, by being the person he would want me to be. He looked at Kat directly. You honor your father by surviving, by rebuilding, by making sure this never happens again. February 1946. The announcement came that German women prisoners would be repatriated, sent home to Germany. The war had been over for 9 months. It was time. Reactions were complicated. Joy at the thought of seeing family, terror at returning to a destroyed country, uncertainty about how they would be received by a population that might view them as traitors for having survived. Kat, Greta, and Anna sat on the barrack steps one evening watching the Louisiana sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. Part of me doesn't want to go back, Kat admitted quietly. Me neither, Greta said. But our families are there. We have to, Anna agreed, for them. The final weeks were bittersweet. The camp administration gave each woman a care package: chocolate, soap, canned food, warm clothing, small gifts to help them survive the journey and the first difficult weeks back in Germany. Captain Brennan came to say goodbye to Kat personally. Promise me something, he said. When you get back, when you're rebuilding your country, remember this. Remember that we were enemies, but we still treated each other as human beings. Remember that peace is possible. Help build a Germany that chooses peace, I promise, Kat said. And she meant it. March 1946. The women boarded trains that would take them to the coast, then ships that would carry them across the Atlantic back to a Germany they barely recognized. Most of them clutched their care packages like treasures. Kat returned to Munich and found her mother and sister living in the basement she had read about. She shared her care package. That American chocolate and those canned goods kept them alive through a brutal winter. She never stopped telling the story of the American doctor who saved her life. The years passed. 1946 became 1950. 1950 became 1960. Germany rebuilt. The ruins were cleared. The wounds began slowly to heal. In the 1960s, Catherine Weber, now in her 50s, sat with her children and told them about Camp Rustin, about the human wall, about Captain Brennan and Corporal Tanaka and Sergeant Wright, about the moment she stopped breathing and the moment she was brought back to life. But Mama, her children asked, weren't the Americans the enemy? They were, Kat said, until they saved my life. Then I learned that there are no enemies, only people. November 1989, the Berlin Wall was falling. East and West Germany were reuniting. The Cold War was ending. An interviewer sat across from an elderly woman in a Munich apartment. Catherine Weber was 76 years old now. Her hair was white. Her hands were marked with age. But her eyes were still sharp and clear. What did you learn in that American prison camp? The interviewer asked. Kat smiled. I learned that propaganda is poison, she said. I learned that the people we're taught to hate are just people. I learned that mercy is not weakness. It's the highest form of strength. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a photograph. It showed her standing beside a small Asian woman. Both were smiling, arms around each other's shoulders. Behind them, the rebuilt Munich Cathedral rose against a blue sky. This is Grace Tanaka, Kat said, the American nurse who saved my life. She visited me in Munich in 1960. We became friends. Sisters, really. She looked at the photograph with obvious affection. The Americans could have let me die, she said. They could have experimented on me the way we were told they would. Instead, they saved my life and asked nothing in return except that I remember their humanity. Her voice was still strong despite her age. And I have. Every day for 44 years, I have remembered. Today, in northern Louisiana, there is a memorial stone where Camp Rustin once stood. The barracks are long gone. The fences have been torn down, the guard towers demolished. But the stone remains with fresh flowers regularly left by descendants of both prisoners and guards. The inscription reads, Camp Rustin, 1943 to 1946, where 347 German women learned that mercy transcends hatred. The story of the human wall became a powerful parable in post-war Germany. It illustrated how propaganda distorts reality, how fear can blind us to kindness, how the hardest walls to tear down are the ones we build in our own minds. But perhaps the most important lesson was this, that even in the darkest times, even between the bitterest enemies, humanity can prevail. That compassion can exist alongside conflict. that a doctor's oath to do no harm transcends nationality and politics. That healing can happen not just for bodies, but for souls. The wall those 40 women built around Catherine Weber's dying body was meant to protect her from monsters. But the real monsters were the lies they had been told. The real protection came from people they had been taught to fear. And the real miracle wasn't the medicine that saved her lungs, it was the mercy that saved her soul. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that compassion can exist even between enemies, please subscribe for more untold stories from World War II. These stories need to be remembered. They show us that even in humanity's darkest hours, there were people who chose kindness over cruelty, mercy over hatred, truth over propaganda. They remind us that the best of America isn't our weapons or our wealth. It's our values. The belief that every human life has dignity, that how we treat our enemies says more about us than how we treat our friends. That freedom and democracy and human decency aren't just words but principles worth living by even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult. Catherine Weber kept her promise to Captain Brennan. She spent the rest of her life working for peace and reconciliation. She spoke at schools and universities. She wrote articles and gave interviews. She told her story to anyone who would listen. And every time she told it, she ended the same way, with a simple truth that had taken her 40 years to fully understand. Mercy is not weakness. It is the highest form of strength. And the people who showed me mercy when I least deserved it taught me what it truly means to be human. That lesson, born in a Louisiana barracks on a September night in 1945, echoes still. In every act of kindness between former enemies. In every choice to see humanity rather than hatred. In every decision to build bridges rather than walls. The human wall came down that night, but the bridge that replaced it stands forever.